Imagine a world where crowns and titles seemed to belong only to men, where dynasties thrived on kings, emperors, and generals. Now picture the Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful families in European history, stretching its influence across kingdoms, empires, and centuries. On the surface, their story reads like an endless parade of stern rulers with scepters in hand. But what if the true architects of their power were not always the men whose names fill the history books? What if the dynasty's survival, its greatest triumphs, and even its most daring gambles were shaped by queens, mothers, and regents working behind the scenes? This is not the tale of passive consorts or silent figures in portraits. This is the untold story of women who wielded influence in ways history often chose to ignore. From Mary of Burgundy's bold defiance that changed the map of Europe, to Joanna of Castile's inheritance that reshaped the dynasty, to Maria Theresa's breathtaking transformation of her empire through her children, these women were far from invisible. They were strategists, diplomats, and rulers in their own right. They held the threads of continuity in moments of crisis, and they used the roles available to them, marriage, regency, and motherhood, to secure the dynasty's survival. In this video, we dive beyond the myth of male dominance to uncover the real story of how Habsburg queens left a legacy as enduring as the crowns their husbands and sons wore. Their mark on history was not just symbolic, it was decisive. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we are exploring the hidden power of Habsburg queens, the women who reshaped Europe from behind thrones, through regencies, and in the upbringing of future rulers. In the winter of the early 17th century, the court in Vienna was gathered for a festival meant to display unity in a dynasty that stretched across half of Europe. The Habsburgs had built their reputation on order, obedience, and the majesty of their Catholic devotion. Yet on that night, while courtiers whispered about military campaigns and diplomats scribbled coded notes to their monarchs, one queen refused to play her expected part. When a male relative tried to pressure her into yielding a political concession, she rose from the table, her gown sweeping across the polished floor, and declared that she would rather walk barefoot through the streets of Vienna than submit to a decision she believed would betray her children's inheritance. The hall fell silent. Those gathered did not expect such a display of independence from a woman whose role, at least in theory, was to adorn the dynasty and bear heirs. This small scene, rarely mentioned in the grand histories of kings and emperors, reveals a hidden truth. Behind the glitter of crowns and titles, Habsburg women were never passive figures. They fought, negotiated, and resisted, even within the tight confines of one of the most patriarchal dynasties in European history. The Habsburg myth, as it came to be known, was one of male dominance and almost divine authority. Chroniclers and later historians painted portraits of stern emperors and calculating archdukes whose marriages were tools of policy, whose decisions directed the fate of nations. Their portraits stared down from palace walls with jaws set and armor gleaming, symbols of an order where women appeared as secondary. The dynasty itself fostered this image, preferring to showcase the men as pillars of continuity while the women were portrayed as compliant spouses or pious widows. Yet this image, repeated across generations, does not fully account for the actual workings of power within the dynasty. The central question emerges: how did women, confined by rules, marriage contracts, and expectations of obedience, manage to wield immense influence in the heart of an empire that appeared to deny them agency? The answer begins with the simple fact that Habsburg power was always fragile, built not only on armies and gold, but also on webs of marriage, inheritance, and faith. In such a system, women were never merely ornaments. They were bridges between kingdoms, negotiators of peace, and guardians of dynastic claims. When emperors marched to war, their sisters, wives, and daughters often defended the family's interests at home. Their signatures, though sometimes hidden behind a husband's seal, shaped treaties and alliances. Their voices, whispered in private chambers, could shift the course of entire reigns. If the Habsburg men were the armor of the dynasty, then the women were its sinew, holding together a body that would otherwise collapse. One must first consider the dynastic marriages that defined Habsburg strategy. The saying, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria," Mary was more than a boast. It was a policy that relied on women as its executors. When a princess left her homeland to wed a king or prince, she did not abandon her Habsburg identity. She carried it across borders, often using her new position to advance Vienna's interests. These women were trained from childhood to understand the stakes of such unions. They were instructed in languages, court etiquette, and the arts of persuasion. While the chronicles may describe their weddings in terms of dowries and pomp, the reality is that these brides became living ambassadors, their bodies and loyalties securing fragile alliances. If their husbands doubted their commitment, they proved it with children who embodied the fusion of two dynasties. Yet in raising those children, they also fought to preserve the Habsburg claim, sometimes against husbands who had different visions. An illuminating example can be seen in the case of Empress Maria Theresa, though her story has often been told with more admiration than scrutiny. She was not simply a ruler in her own right, but also a woman who inherited a throne against immense opposition. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, had spent years securing recognition of the Pragmatic Sanction, a document declaring that his daughters could inherit the Habsburg lands in the absence of sons. Many rulers swore to honor it, yet at his death, several reneged, plunging her into the War of the Austrian Succession. Here, the myth of male dominance shatters most clearly. Maria Theresa, young and newly married, stood before the Hungarian Diet in a moment of crisis. Dressed in black mourning, she carried her infant son in her arms, appealing directly to the loyalty of her subjects. The sight of a queen asking for their defense stirred them to arms. This was not passive femininity, but deliberate performance of power. She ruled for decades, reformed her territories, and bore 16 children, each of whom became a tool of diplomacy. Her reign showed that in a dynasty supposedly defined by men, a woman could stand at the very center. But even before Maria Theresa, less visible figures were shaping the dynasty. Queens and archduchesses acted as regents during the absence or minority of male heirs. Some of these regencies are rarely remembered, yet they reveal the constant presence of women in governance. When an emperor traveled to inspect troops or attend foreign negotiations, a trusted female relative often held the keys of authority at home. These regents signed decrees, directed finances, and consulted with ministers. Their authority may have been defined as temporary, but it trained them in the exercise of command and gave them a taste of the machinery of state. Moreover, many continued to advise long after the official regency ended, drawing on their knowledge and networks. Religious devotion also offered Habsburg women a form of influence. The dynasty prided itself on its Catholic faith, and women were often at the forefront of that identity. Queens and princesses sponsored monasteries, built churches, and promoted confessional unity in lands divided by the Reformation. Yet their piety was not merely a private virtue. It carried political weight. When a queen endorsed a Jesuit mission, she sent a signal to both allies and enemies. When a princess entered a convent, she created a center of loyalty that reinforced Habsburg power. Even cloistered daughters were far from powerless. They corresponded with brothers and nephews, advised them on matters of conscience, and served as intermediaries in delicate disputes. Their prayers, patronage, and counsel were woven into the very structure of Catholic monarchy. At times, Habsburg women used their position in more subversive ways. Court life was full of factions, with ministers vying for influence and diplomats trying to sway decisions. A clever queen or archduchess could play these rivalries to her advantage. By granting access, withholding a favor, or leaking information, she could tilt the balance of power. Some built circles of allies that endured for decades, shielding them from political storms. Others wrote letters filled with subtle warnings or veiled threats that could redirect the course of policy. To dismiss these maneuvers as gossip is to underestimate their impact. In courts where decisions were made as much in drawing rooms as in council chambers, the female voice could be decisive. Marriage, motherhood, and regency gave women overt roles, but their influence also extended into culture. Patronage of the arts, music, and architecture was not only a matter of taste. It broadcast dynastic power. When a queen commissioned a palace wing or sponsored an opera, she was shaping the image of the dynasty for both subjects and foreigners. The works that survive on canvas and stone are testimony to how these women defined the aesthetic of empire. They chose which saints would be honored, which composers would be supported, and which painters would be remembered. In this sense, they were not only political actors, but also creators of cultural memory. The resistance of Habsburg women to being mere ornaments often came at personal cost. They endured arranged marriages that placed them in hostile courts. They were expected to produce heirs under constant scrutiny, with every miscarriage or stillbirth treated as a dynastic crisis. They were blamed for infertility, even when medical knowledge was primitive. Yet within these pressures, some women carved out space for independence. They wrote extensive correspondence, leaving behind records of their thoughts, fears, and strategies. These letters, preserved in archives, reveal sharp minds analyzing diplomacy, economics, and the ambitions of rival families. They rarely appear in official chronicles, but they remind us that women were thinking politically even when their actions were restricted. The question of how women wielded power in a dynasty that proclaimed male dominance is therefore answered in layers. They did so as mothers, ensuring dynastic continuity. They did so as regents, holding authority in times of absence. They did so as patrons, shaping religious and cultural identity. They did so as negotiators, both in marriage alliances and in the daily intrigues of court life. At times, they even did so as sovereigns like Maria Theresa, who proved that the throne itself was not beyond female reach. Their influence was not always visible, and it was often denied by the very system they served, but it was nonetheless real. One might wonder why this influence has been overlooked for so long. Part of the answer lies in the sources themselves. Chroniclers, often men serving the dynasty, preferred to glorify emperors and downplay the contributions of women. Historians, writing in later centuries, inherited these biases, repeating the myth of male authority. It is only in recent decades, with greater attention to letters, household records, and cultural patronage, that the full scope of female power within the Habsburgs has come to light. To see the dynasty clearly is to recognize that it was not only a line of emperors, but also a network of queens, archduchesses, and daughters whose actions kept the machine running. Another reason is the dynasty's own preference for stability. By promoting the image of obedient women, the Habsburgs reinforced their claim to order. An empire that portrayed itself as guided by stern fathers was easier to justify in a world of competing monarchies. Yet beneath this mask, reality was far more complex. The anecdote of the defiant queen in Vienna was not unique. Such moments of refusal, assertion, and determination appeared across the centuries. They were simply less convenient for the mythmakers to remember. The story of Habsburg women, then, is not one of rebellion against the dynasty, but of working within its structures to carve out spaces of power. Their defiance was often quiet rather than loud, persistent rather than dramatic. They bent rules, exploited opportunities, and used relationships to assert themselves. They knew the risks of open confrontation, so they mastered subtler forms of influence. This does not make their actions less significant. On the contrary, it highlights the creativity and resilience required to exercise power in a system designed to exclude them. Seen in this light, the history of the Habsburgs becomes richer and more human. It is not merely a parade of emperors and battles, but a tapestry of family dynamics, personal struggles, and unexpected victories. The women of the dynasty remind us that even in the most hierarchical structures, power is never absolute. It flows through relationships, symbols, and decisions, often in ways that escape the eye of official chroniclers. To study them is not to diminish the role of the emperors, but to recognize that their reigns would have been impossible without the constant work of their mothers, sisters, and wives. The silence that followed the defiant queen's outburst in Vienna captures the essence of this hidden history. Those around her may have been shocked, but they could not ignore her. Her words, like the actions of so many other Habsburg women, forced recognition of a truth long concealed. That even in a dynasty devoted to the image of male power, women shaped the fate of empires. They did so not in spite of their roles as wives and mothers, but often through them, transforming supposed limitations into tools of influence. Beyond the crown jewels and the portraits of emperors lies a story of queens whose strength carried the dynasty through its greatest trials. The story of the Habsburg women is not complete without looking further back, before Maria Theresa's dramatic assertion of sovereignty, to the earliest generations of queens and consorts whose maneuvering prepared the ground for all that followed. These women were not sovereigns in their own right, at least not officially, yet they acted as unseen architects of empire. They navigated a world where their voices were meant to be quiet and their choices limited, and still they found ways to transform marriage, diplomacy, and family loyalty into instruments of power. Their efforts helped turn a once modest dynasty into one of the most formidable houses in Europe, setting a precedent that future generations of Habsburg women would continue. One cannot begin such a story without considering Mary of Burgundy, whose brief life altered the destiny of the entire dynasty. When her father, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, died suddenly in battle in the late 15th century, Mary inherited one of the most prosperous and culturally brilliant realms in Europe. Burgundy stretched across rich cities, fertile lands, and important trade routes, making it a prize coveted by France and the Habsburgs alike. Mary was barely 20, inexperienced and under enormous pressure. The French king hoped to seize her inheritance through force or marriage, while her subjects demanded confirmation of their liberties in exchange for support. In this perilous moment, Mary displayed remarkable determination. Against French pressure, she chose to marry Maximilian of Habsburg, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. This union was not only a marriage, but a masterstroke of strategy. By binding Burgundy to the Habsburgs, Mary shifted the balance of power in Europe. Though she died tragically young after a riding accident, the legacy of her decision endured. Her children became the heirs of both Burgundy and Austria, a combination that gave the Habsburgs immense strength. Without Mary's choice and courage, the empire we associate with the name Habsburg might never have existed. Mary's story also reveals the double edge of dynastic marriages. She was caught between immense external pressures and the expectations of her own people, yet she managed to transform what could have been her downfall into a decisive victory for her house. Her life reminds us that queenship was never a passive condition. It required judgment, foresight, and the ability to act in moments of crisis. In doing so, she laid the foundation for the myth of Habsburg destiny, even though she herself did not live to see its full unfolding. Another essential figure in this story is Joanna of Castile, remembered unfairly in history as the Mad. Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, was married to Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy. This marriage was another example of dynastic strategy, uniting Spanish kingdoms with the Habsburg line. Through Joanna, the Habsburgs gained a claim to Spain and its growing overseas empire. Yet her life also illustrates the personal costs borne by women who were at the heart of political strategies but denied agency. Historians have long debated the extent of her supposed madness, but it is clear that much of her reputation was shaped by the men around her who sought to control her inheritance. Her father, her husband, and later her son all used the claim of her instability as a pretext to sideline her. Yet the fact remains that Joanna was the rightful heir to Castile and Aragon, and it was through her that the Habsburgs secured Spain. Her existence, her bloodline, and her marriage brought together the two great halves of the dynasty, the Austrian and the Spanish branches. Even if she was confined and silenced, her role as a dynastic pivot cannot be denied. What is striking in Joanna's story is how her very presence shaped the empire. Her marriage to Philip connected the Habsburgs to Spain's immense wealth and colonial expansion, while her children became rulers of both the Old World and the New. Charles, her son, would become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruling an empire on which it was said the sun never set. This global Habsburg empire, stretching from Vienna to the Americas, would not have been possible without Joanna's inheritance. Yet she herself was marginalized, demonstrating the paradox of female power in the dynasty. Indispensable in substance, often invisible in form. The men who sought to confine her could not erase the fact that her body and her lineage carried the empire into being. Mary of Burgundy and Joanna of Castile stand as emblematic of a broader pattern. Habsburg women often served as bridges between realms, carrying rights, lands, and claims that transformed the political map. But they were not simply vessels of inheritance. Their choices, their resistance, and their negotiations shaped how those inheritances were secured. Early queens understood that they were playing for high stakes, and they used every tool at their disposal. In some cases, this meant direct political action. In others, it meant shrewd negotiation behind the scenes, guiding husbands or protecting the interests of children. Either way, their fingerprints are visible across the architecture of empire. Consider also the role of Margaret of Austria, daughter of Mary of Burgundy. Though she never reigned in her own right, she became one of the most effective regents of her time. Married and widowed young, Margaret returned to the Habsburg fold and devoted herself to the family's cause. As regent of the Netherlands for her nephew Charles, she administered territories that were economically vital and politically turbulent. Margaret showed a gift for diplomacy, negotiating treaties and maintaining stability in lands that could easily have slipped from Habsburg control. She corresponded with monarchs, advised her nephew, and created a court at Mechlin that became a center of culture and politics. Through her, the dynasty preserved its Burgundian inheritance and prepared the way for Charles to ascend as the most powerful monarch of his era. Margaret demonstrates how women who might otherwise have been sidelined used regency and guardianship to wield real authority. She shaped the education of the young Charles, instilling in him a sense of Habsburg mission. Without her careful management, the unity of the Burgundian and Spanish inheritance might not have held. The examples of Mary, Joanna, and Margaret illustrate a pattern that runs throughout the Habsburg story. Women, through marriage and regency, were not incidental to power but central to it. Their influence was not always recognized by chroniclers, yet their actions laid the groundwork for the empire's rise. Each decision they made carried consequences for the balance of power in Europe. Each act of defiance or negotiation reinforced the dynasty's hold on its vast possessions. While their names may be overshadowed by emperors and kings, their roles were indispensable in shaping the very empire those men ruled. The unseen architects of empire also left a legacy in culture and identity. The courts they established, the networks they maintained, and the symbols they endorsed gave the Habsburgs their distinctive aura of Catholic devotion, dynastic continuity, and imperial grandeur. Queens and regents fostered artists, commissioned buildings, and supported religious orders, ensuring that their influence endured not only in treaties, but also in the cultural memory of Europe. By sponsoring these works, they presented the dynasty as divinely favored and unshakably stable, even when its political foundations were fragile. These cultural investments were not trivial but strategic, reinforcing the legitimacy of a dynasty whose rule spanned diverse peoples and vast lands. It is in this sense that the early queens were architects, shaping the empire not with armies but with alliances, marriages, and cultural vision. They were constrained by the structures of their time, yet they found ways to bend those structures to their advantage. Their lives reveal the contradictions of a dynasty that proclaimed male dominance while relying fundamentally on the agency of women. They did not overthrow the system, but they worked within it with skill and tenacity, ensuring that the Habsburg Empire could grow and endure. Without Mary of Burgundy's defiance, without Joanna of Castile's inheritance, without Margaret of Austria's regency, the later triumphs of Maria Theresa and her daughters would have been impossible. These women built the scaffolding on which the dynasty's power rested, and in doing so, they left a mark on European history that deserves recognition. Their stories remind us that power often operates in hidden ways, through decisions made in private chambers or sacrifices made in personal lives. The empire that later dazzled the world with crowns, jewels, and armies was in many ways the creation of queens whose strength lay not in open command, but in persistence, judgment, and vision. They were the unseen architects of empire, and their legacy endures in the very fabric of European history. The groundwork laid by women such as Mary of Burgundy, Joanna of Castile, and Margaret of Austria revealed that Habsburg power could never have endured without the constant involvement of queens, princesses, and dowagers. Their marriages carried the dynasty into new territories, but their strength at home was just as vital. The next stage in the story belongs to those women who stepped beyond the ceremonial role of consort or mother and ruled directly in times of necessity. The figure of the regent occupies a special place in dynastic history, for regencies were not simply placeholders. They demanded decision-making, administration, and the ability to preserve authority in moments when men were absent, too young, or otherwise unable to rule. In these spaces, Habsburg women revealed their political acumen, proving themselves capable of governing in their own right. Their actions not only preserved stability, but often advanced the dynasty's interests in ways that shaped the very course of the empire. One striking example of this is Maria of Austria, sister of Charles V. Maria married King Louis of Hungary and Bohemia, who perished at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. Widowed young and childless, Maria might easily have been consigned to a life of pious retirement, as was often the fate of women in her position. Instead, she became a formidable political figure. After her brother Charles and her other brother Ferdinand took on the crowns of Spain and Austria respectively, Maria emerged as a trusted partner in governance. She served as regent of the Netherlands, a position of enormous responsibility. The Low Countries were wealthy, rebellious, and strategically essential, requiring careful balance between maintaining imperial authority and respecting local privileges. Maria showed remarkable skill in this role, navigating factional rivalries, managing finances, and negotiating with estates. She worked tirelessly to defend Habsburg interests, often standing firm against both French encroachment and local unrest. Her correspondence with Charles reveals a woman who understood the fine balance of power politics, who could argue her case forcefully and manage competing pressures. Maria also illustrates the unique challenges faced by female regents. She was constantly scrutinized for her gender, with rivals questioning her capacity to rule and critics eager to exploit any sign of weakness. Yet she overcame these obstacles by relying on a blend of pragmatism and authority. She cultivated advisors who respected her judgment and developed a reputation for seriousness and devotion to her duties. Unlike many of her male contemporaries, she avoided extravagance and emphasized discipline in governance, which won her grudging respect even among critics. Her regency reveals the depth of female participation in Habsburg politics and the degree to which the dynasty depended on her competence during crucial decades. Equally important is Eleanor of Austria, another sister in the same remarkable generation. Eleanor's life demonstrates the multiple layers of female political engagement. She was married first to the King of Portugal, later to Francis I of France, in both cases serving as a bridge between the Habsburgs and their rivals. Yet beyond these diplomatic unions, Eleanor took on direct political responsibilities. When widowed for the first time, she involved herself in negotiations between her brothers and her Portuguese in-laws. Later, as Queen of France, she played a subtle but meaningful role in attempts to broker peace between her husband and her brother Charles. Though she lacked formal regency in France, she was nonetheless an active participant in political life. After Francis's death, she returned to her Habsburg family and remained a trusted counselor in their councils. Eleanor's political career shows that regency was not the only form of authority. Even Queen's consort, when intelligent and determined, could exert pressure on the highest affairs of state. Another figure who embodies the regency role is Margaret of Parma, illegitimate daughter of Charles V. Though her birth might have excluded her from high position, her father recognized her ability and appointed her as governor of the Netherlands. In this role, she confronted one of the most difficult periods in Habsburg history, as religious dissent and noble unrest threatened imperial control. Margaret struggled with limited resources and competing instructions from Madrid, but she worked to preserve order. Her administration reveals both the possibilities and constraints of female regency. She had authority, yet she was often second-guessed or undermined by male advisors sent from Spain. Still, she managed to hold the Netherlands together long enough for Philip II to impose a more direct rule. Her story underscores the tension between central authority and local autonomy, as well as the personal resilience required of a woman in such a position. The recurring pattern in these regencies is that they were not ceremonial placeholders. They involved the daily grind of governance, reviewing petitions, balancing budgets, issuing decrees, and maintaining loyalty among nobles. These responsibilities demanded not only intelligence but also endurance and tact. Women like Maria of Austria and Margaret of Parma proved that they possessed these qualities in abundance. Their successes were measured not in dramatic victories, but in the quieter triumph of preserving stability amid constant pressure. The challenges they faced were immense. They operated in societies where the expectation was that women should obey rather than command. Their authority was often defined as temporary, tied to the absence of men. Rivals watched closely for mistakes, eager to interpret any misstep as proof of female incapacity. They also faced personal challenges, such as the loneliness of widowhood or the pain of separation from children, all while carrying the burden of empire. Yet they overcame these obstacles by drawing on networks of advisors, cultivating reputations for integrity, and using the very assumptions about femininity to their advantage. A queen regent could present herself as a mother protecting her subjects, or as a widow acting in the memory of her husband, cloaking authority in acceptable forms while exercising it in practice. These regents were not anomalies, but part of a broader tradition in the dynasty. Time and again, when crises struck, the Habsburgs turned to their women to safeguard continuity. It was a practical recognition that the survival of the dynasty could not depend solely on absent kings or distant emperors. In many cases, the regent was the one figure who could bridge gaps between generations, holding the throne for a child too young to rule or maintaining authority while a husband campaigned abroad. This role was as essential to the functioning of the dynasty as any battlefield victory or diplomatic treaty. The image of Maria of Austria in Brussels, Eleanor mediating between France and Spain, or Margaret of Parma struggling to contain religious rebellion captures the essence of this tradition. These women did not seek to overturn the patriarchal structure of their world, but they operated within it with skill and determination. Their legacies remind us that the empire was not built solely by emperors and kings. It was also preserved by regents whose intelligence and perseverance ensured that the dynasty survived its most fragile moments. The story of regency within the Habsburgs also forces us to question how we define power. Too often, history celebrates those who commanded armies or signed great treaties. Yet the regent's power lay in preservation, in maintaining order and continuity. It was less visible, but no less vital. Without these women, the empire might have fractured during periods of uncertainty. Their ability to govern in their own right proves that the myth of Habsburg male dominance concealed a deeper reality, that women were integral to the machinery of rule. In reflecting on these figures, one sees continuity with the earlier queens who laid the dynastic foundations. Just as Mary of Burgundy's marriage secured the Burgundian inheritance and Joanna of Castile's lineage brought Spain into the fold, so too did Maria of Austria and Eleanor of Austria ensure that these vast territories remained governed with competence. Their regencies were not acts of mere survival but of deliberate statecraft, shaping the trajectory of the empire for decades to come. The challenges they faced, and the ways they overcame them, speak to their resilience. They confronted doubts about their gender, hostility from local elites, and interference from male relatives, yet they endured. They relied on persuasion, negotiation, and steady administration rather than force. In doing so, they carved out a legacy that reminds us that governance is not only about conquest, but about stability. These women were the guardians of continuity, the power behind the throne when the throne itself was vulnerable. They kept the empire intact, and for that, their names deserve to stand alongside the emperors whose reigns they protected. The legacy of the Habsburg regents naturally leads to another, equally powerful arena in which queens, empresses, and archduchesses exerted influence, the realm of motherhood. In dynasties where legitimacy and continuity mattered above all else, the role of the mother was never a private matter. It was political by definition. The ability to bear heirs, to raise them, to guide their education, and to orchestrate their marriages was central to the survival of the house. In the Habsburg world, where marriages were famously used as weapons of strategy, mothers became master tacticians. Their choices and their persistence shaped not only the personal futures of their children, but the very map of Europe. Far from being passive figures, they were dynastic architects who secured alliances, fostered loyalty, and trained rulers to carry forward the immense weight of Habsburg identity. The most striking example of this power is Maria Theresa of Austria. When she inherited her father's crown in the mid-18th century, many doubted that a woman could preserve the dynasty. She was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by enemies eager to exploit her vulnerability. Yet Maria Theresa did not simply hold on to her inheritance, she transformed it. She combined the determination of her predecessors with an unshakable belief in her family's destiny. At the heart of her rule was not only her own authority, but the way she managed her role as mother to an extraordinary brood of 16 children. Each of them became a living instrument of policy, placed strategically across Europe in ways that extended the Habsburg reach far beyond the borders of Austria. Maria Theresa understood that motherhood was a form of governance. She involved herself directly in the education of her children, insisting that they be raised not only with piety and discipline, but also with a clear sense of their responsibilities to the dynasty. She supervised their tutors, monitored their progress, and corrected their behavior. She emphasized both obedience and a sense of duty, ensuring that her children internalized the values of loyalty to family and devotion to Catholicism. For her, education was not a matter of individual flourishing, but of dynastic survival. A careless child, an indulgent ruler, or a rebellious son could undo the work of generations. By shaping her children carefully, Maria Theresa was shaping the future of the empire itself. The marriages she arranged demonstrate her strategic vision. Perhaps the most famous was that of her daughter Maria Antonia, who became Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. By marrying her daughter into the French court, Maria Theresa hoped to heal the long rivalry between Austria and France. For centuries, the two powers had been bitter enemies. Yet through this marriage, the Empress sought to turn hostility into alliance. Though the eventual fate of Marie Antoinette in the French Revolution casts a tragic shadow over this union, the decision itself reveals the boldness of Maria Theresa's approach. She was willing to gamble with her daughter's future to secure what she believed was a lasting peace for the dynasty. Other children were deployed with equal precision. One son became emperor, another became Duke of Tuscany. Daughters were married into the royal families of Naples, Parma, and Saxony. Each placement extended Habsburg influence into a new region, creating a network of alliances that bound Europe together under the threads of kinship. These were not random matches but carefully calculated unions, meant to stabilize the dynasty's position and to counterbalance rivals. Maria Theresa approached the marriages of her children with the eye of a general deploying troops, aware that each placement could shift the balance of power. What makes Maria Theresa remarkable is not only her use of motherhood as politics, but also the way she combined it with active governance. She reformed the administration of her lands, strengthened the army, and modernized finances, all while personally guiding the futures of her children. In this sense, she blurred the line between public authority and private family, demonstrating that for a queen, the two were inseparable. Her power as matriarch was as significant as her power as monarch. Indeed, the two reinforced one another. Her success as a ruler gave weight to her choices as a mother, while her ability to direct her children's futures amplified her political reach. The emphasis on motherhood as political capital did not begin with Maria Theresa, though she represents its fullest expression. Earlier Habsburg women also understood the importance of shaping the dynasty through their children. Queens who married into foreign courts often took great pains to preserve their children's loyalty to the Habsburg line. They raised them with stories of family honor and duty, ensuring that even when those children inherited other thrones, their loyalties remained tied to Vienna or Madrid. In this way, mothers became guardians of identity, transmitting the values and traditions that gave the dynasty cohesion. This maternal influence was especially crucial in times of uncertainty. When succession was contested or when heirs were young, mothers provided continuity. They acted as both protectors and educators, ensuring that the dynasty's future leaders were prepared for the burdens they would inherit. Even when widowed or marginalized, many Habsburg mothers maintained strong control over their children's upbringing, using their role as mothers to carve out political authority that no one could easily challenge. It is worth remembering that childbearing itself was seen as a political act. Each successful birth secured the dynasty's future, while each miscarriage or death threatened its stability. Habsburg women lived under constant pressure to produce heirs, and their bodies were monitored and judged as instruments of state policy. Yet beyond this biological role, they transformed motherhood into strategy. By raising their children carefully, by arranging their marriages shrewdly, and by instilling in them a sense of dynastic mission, they ensured that their influence extended far beyond the nursery. Maria Theresa's case also highlights the difficulties that came with this role. She faced criticism for being overbearing with her children, for involving herself too deeply in their lives, and for pushing them into marriages that were personally unhappy. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette, the frustrations of Joseph II, and the struggles of other children remind us that dynastic strategy often came at a personal cost. Yet from the perspective of the dynasty, Maria Theresa's approach was effective. Her children were placed at the centers of power across Europe, and the Habsburg presence was secured in ways that might otherwise have been impossible. The example of Maria Theresa underscores a larger truth about the Habsburgs. The dynasty was as much a family as it was a political structure. The personal lives of its members were inseparable from the fate of the empire. In this context, mothers were not simply private figures, but central actors in the drama of power. Their role in shaping their children's futures was equivalent to shaping the destiny of Europe itself. If regents like Maria of Austria and Margaret of Parma safeguarded the dynasty in times of vulnerability, then mothers like Maria Theresa expanded its reach through careful planning of the next generation. The two roles were linked. Both reveal how women worked within the structures of their time to exercise power in ways that were both practical and far-reaching. The regent preserved the present, the mother secured the future. Together, they ensured the continuity of the dynasty across centuries. The story of strategic mothers and matriarchs also forces us to reconsider the boundaries of politics. We often think of politics as occurring in council chambers, on battlefields, or in treaties. Yet for the Habsburgs, politics also occurred in nurseries, in marriage negotiations, and in the private correspondence of mothers guiding their children. These quieter forms of power were no less significant than the more visible acts of kings and emperors. They remind us that empire was built not only by men wielding swords and pens, but also by women shaping the hearts and futures of their sons and daughters. The Habsburg dynasty, so often portrayed as a fortress of male dominance, in fact depended on the constant work of women who used the tools available to them to assert influence. As regents, they preserved stability. As mothers, they secured the future. As wives, they forged alliances. Their contributions were often obscured in official histories, yet their importance cannot be denied. Maria Theresa's reign makes this truth impossible to ignore, for she embodied all these roles at once: sovereign, regent, mother, and matriarch. Her children carried her vision into courts across Europe, ensuring that her influence would extend far beyond her own lifetime. The legacy of these strategic mothers continues to echo in the history of Europe. The map of alliances, the ties of kinship, the cultural identity of nations, all bear the imprint of queens who understood that motherhood was a form of statecraft. They reveal a dimension of power often overlooked yet essential to the endurance of dynasties. In the Habsburg story, as in so many others, the future of empire was written not only in treaties and battles, but also in the quiet determination of mothers who saw in their children the continuation of a legacy greater than themselves. The legacy of strategic mothers and dynastic matriarchs leads us naturally to the question of memory and how these women are remembered, or more often forgotten, in the telling of history. For centuries, the Habsburg dynasty was described as a fortress of male rule, its portraits dominated by armored emperors and stern-faced kings who seemed to carry the fate of Europe upon their shoulders. This narrative has proven remarkably enduring, for it suited both the dynasty's image and the chroniclers who served it. Yet beneath this official version of events lies a richer and more complex truth. The real story of the Habsburgs cannot be told without acknowledging the queens, regents, and mothers whose labor sustained the dynasty across generations. Their presence was not decorative, but foundational. They left marks that shaped the political, cultural, and familial fabric of Europe itself. To grasp this legacy, one must look not only at the individuals, but at the cumulative effect of their actions. Mary of Burgundy's marriage decision in the 15th century altered the trajectory of European politics by linking Burgundy to the Habsburg line. Joanna of Castile's inheritance brought Spain and its empire into the family fold, even though she herself was confined and silenced. Margaret of Austria provided stability and guidance as regent of the Netherlands, preserving a vital region for her nephew Charles. Maria of Austria and Eleanor of Austria held power in moments when male rulers were absent, their steady hands ensuring that the machinery of governance did not collapse. Margaret of Parma braved the storm of rebellion in the Netherlands, struggling to reconcile the demands of empire with the desires of local elites. Finally, Maria Theresa, perhaps the most famous of all, redefined queenship itself by ruling not only as mother of her children, but as mother of her empire, shaping its administration and its future through reform, marriage diplomacy, and education. These examples, far from isolated, reveal a pattern. Women were not merely filling gaps in times of crisis, but acting as active participants in the creation and preservation of dynastic power. They understood the fragility of empire and used the roles available to them, whether as regents, consorts, or mothers, to secure stability. Their influence did not always bear their names, for often their acts were absorbed into the achievements of husbands, brothers, or sons. Yet without them, the dynasty would have fractured long before it reached its height. They were the glue that held together a family stretched across diverse kingdoms, languages, and cultures. The impact of these women extended far beyond the boundaries of the Habsburg house itself. Their marriages reshaped alliances, redirecting the flow of European diplomacy. A Habsburg daughter sent to France or Naples was not simply a bride, but a diplomatic ambassador, embodying a peace or an alliance that might hold for decades. Their cultural patronage enriched Europe's artistic and religious life, with convents, churches, and palaces bearing testimony to their devotion. Their insistence on Catholic identity reinforced the dynasty's role as champion of the faith during times of religious conflict. Their children, raised with careful instruction, carried these values into other courts, spreading Habsburg influence like threads woven across the continent. By emphasizing these contributions, we challenge the traditional male-centric view of history that portrays women as passive ornaments. The Habsburg queens were not shadows lurking in the background of grand politics. They were actors in their own right, wielding influence in forms that contemporaries often preferred not to acknowledge, but could never escape. Their power was not the blunt force of military conquest, but the subtler, equally decisive force of continuity, diplomacy, education, and patronage. They preserved dynasties, secured alliances, and ensured that the Habsburg name carried weight long after individual emperors had passed from the scene. This redefinition of legacy also asks us to reconsider what power itself means. Too often, history equates power with visibility. The crown on the head, the sword in the hand, the decree signed with flourish. Yet the power of the Habsburg women often lay in invisibility, in influence that operated through relationships, decisions within the household, or the shaping of a child's worldview. Their power was embedded in the very fabric of dynastic survival, making it no less real for being less obvious. In some ways, it was more enduring, for while battles were won and lost, the careful placement of a daughter in a strategic marriage or the steady guidance of a regent secured stability for generations. Maria Theresa captures this dual legacy most clearly. She was both monarch and matriarch, reformer and mother, embodying in her person the synthesis of authority and nurturing that defined Habsburg queenship. Yet even she has often been remembered more for the tragedies of her children, most famously Marie Antoinette, than for the systemic changes she enacted in administration, education, and military organization. Her reign reminds us that female authority was not an aberration, but a possibility within the dynasty, and one that shaped Europe profoundly. The hidden legacy of earlier women, like Mary of Burgundy and Joanna of Castile, deserves equal recognition. They did not wield armies or sit in imperial councils for decades, but their decisions and inheritances determined the very structure of the Habsburg Empire. Without Mary's defiance in choosing Maximilian, there would be no link between Austria and Burgundy. Without Joanna's marriage, Spain would not have entered the Habsburg sphere, and the empire of Charles V would never have existed. These women may not have been celebrated in their time, but they redefined Europe nonetheless. The story of regents like Maria of Austria or Margaret of Parma shows us that governance was not simply a masculine prerogative. These women confronted the full weight of political reality, facing rebellion, negotiation, and the challenges of ruling diverse territories. They held their ground in moments when male rulers were absent or distracted, and in doing so, they demonstrated that competence in governance was not bound by gender. Their legacies are measured not in grand conquests, but in the survival of empire through turbulent times. If the Habsburg dynasty is remembered for its endurance, for stretching across centuries and territories, then that endurance owes as much to its women as to its men. They were the unseen architects, the guardians of continuity, and the shapers of the future. Their stories complicate the myth of male dominance and reveal that the dynasty's true strength lay in the combination of visible and invisible power, of emperors commanding from thrones and queens weaving stability through family, diplomacy, and regency. As we reflect on this history, we are left with a lingering thought about how much influence remains hidden in the folds of historical narrative. How many decisions attributed to emperors were in fact shaped by the counsel of wives, sisters, or mothers? How many alliances sealed by marriage were the product of a queen's persistence rather than a king's strategy? How much of the dynasty's cultural identity was fostered not by male patronage, but by the devotion of women who saw art, religion, and architecture as instruments of legacy? These questions remind us that the history we inherit is often incomplete, shaped by biases that favored male visibility and dismissed female agency. The queens of the Habsburg dynasty compel us to revise that narrative. They show us that power does not always wear a crown or command an army. Sometimes it speaks through the defiance of a young duchess refusing to submit, through the endurance of a widow governing in her brother's name, through the guiding hand of a mother shaping her children's futures. Their legacy redefines not only the history of a dynasty, but the history of Europe itself, reminding us that influence often lies where chroniclers chose not to look. To understand the Habsburgs fully is to recognize that their empire was not sustained by emperors alone. It was sustained by queens who carried the weight of continuity, by regents who governed with skill, and by mothers who crafted the futures of nations through the lives of their children. Their legacy endures in the alliances they forged, the culture they nurtured, and the stability they preserved. It endures also in the challenge they pose to us. To see history not only in the loud declarations of kings, but in the quiet determination of queens whose influence was no less profound. And perhaps the final measure of their legacy is this: that though their contributions were long obscured, they continue to shape how we understand the past today. Their lives remind us that history is not merely a record of rulers and battles, but a tapestry woven by many hands, some of which worked unseen, yet left threads that endure through the centuries. In the story of the Habsburgs, those hands belonged as much to queens as to kings, and their legacy remains a vital part of Europe's heritage.